Hi, I'm Grayson Carter, and this is a lecture on Indigenous peoples, slavery, and the Church. Many areas of history are contentious. The treatment of Indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, Australia, and elsewhere is one such example of this, as is, of course, the institution of slavery. Close to home, the American Civil War continues to divide opinion and neighbors. Why was it fought? What did it settle? Was it a battle over states' rights, as many have been taught, or was it a battle to end slavery? The debate rumbles on, resulting in considerable heat, but seldom much light. Of course, the destructive treatment of Indigenous peoples and the institution of slavery have been around since earliest times, documented extensively in the Old Testament and in other ancient sources. Few nations, in fact, have been free of guilt over such behavior. To say the least, these issues have presented serious challenges to the Christian Church throughout the world, which have not always been easily resolved. This short and admittedly inadequate lecture surveys the Church's response to the treatment of Indigenous peoples and to the institution of slavery in modern times. When adventurers traveled during the age of exploration, chaplains and sometimes missionaries often accompanied them. Beginning in the late 15th century, the Catholic Church began to acknowledge the new global context in which it now found itself. As early as 1492, the Pope ordered that native populations be given spiritual guidance for the salvation of their souls. Although the Church's record on their treatment was mixed, it did officially recognize that native people were human beings made in God's image, and were thus in need of salvation. They were not an inferior subspecies, as some claimed. In 1501, the Queen of Spain declared Native Americans as subjects of the Spanish crown and forbid their enslavement, except in exceptional circumstances. However, she also allowed for the establishment of the economedia system, which between 1503 and 1542 led to the virtual enslavement of many indigenous people in Latin America. This prompted the formal protest to the crown by Bartholomew de la Casa. Casas was a former slave trader who now opposed it. He became a Dominican friar and spent much of his life lobbying for the abolition of the economedia system, which granted landowners the right to the services of Native American laborers in exchange for their protection. In 1511, the Spanish Dominican friar Montes Inos preached a sermon to the wealthy elites on the island of Hispaniola, denouncing the unjust treatment of the natives and calling the congregation to love them as they love themselves. While his sermon was not well received, it raised concerns in the government, which reached all the way back to Spain, sparking an investigation of his claims of mistreatment. In 1537, the Pope officially forbade the enslavement of Native Americans. Although this was frequently ignored, it nevertheless established a baseline of support for Catholic missionaries defending the rights of indigenous people. In 1542, the Spanish passed the so-called New Laws, which finally abolished the economedia system and provided greater protection for native peoples. Protestant explorers, on the other hand, from England, Holland, Germany, Denmark, and elsewhere, were guided in their treatment of native people by the laws and conventions of their own countries, which naturally varied considerably. However, among Protestant nations, widespread recognition of the rights and integrity of indigenous peoples was slow to materialize, and countless acts, ranging from indifference to genocide, scar the history of Protestant settlement in North and South America, Africa, Oceania, and elsewhere. An important component in the history of the Church is the institution of slavery, which occupied over many centuries and which took many different forms. The forced labor and religious conversions of a vast number of native peoples in the Americas and elsewhere was tantamount to slavery. Even more significant was the initiation of the transatlantic slave trade around a decade after Columbus's first voyage in 1492. Between 1502 and 1866, over 11 million Africans were brought to the New World, either to the United States, their American colonies before that, Brazil, the Caribbean, or Central and South America. In addition, many settlers to America came as indentured servants, which was often tantamount to slavery. The Catholic Church had a long and complex relationship with slavery, at times prohibiting it and laboring to overturn it in its pernicious effects, and at other times accommodating its presence or even promoting it. To its credit, the Church did declare in the 16th century that slaves were to be baptized as soon as possible upon their arrival from Africa, and many were. This recognized their existence as human beings, often a contested point, though the choice to be baptized was not always presented freely, nor were many slaves given instruction in the new faith into which they were being received. Not a few Catholic friars, monks, and priests became involved in slavery in one way or another, while others protested the slave trade and slavery itself, becoming the champions of the oppressed. This resulted in a mixed history among the Catholic clergy regarding slavery. Haiti formally declared independence from France in 1804 and became the first sovereign nation in the Western Hemisphere, unconditionally, to abolish slavery. Slavery had existed in Britain from ancient times until the 12th century, when it was replaced by feudalism, which was in effect another form of slavery, as well as in a very limited numbers in modern times. In 1772, however, a court in London ruled that any person held in slavery in England was automatically granted his or her freedom when they stepped foot on English soil, effectively abolishing slavery in Britain. Other European countries acted similarly. Of course, slavery still exists in Europe and in all other developed countries, especially in wealthy Middle Eastern countries, in the form of human trafficking, typically enslaving those from poor backgrounds. Although America is often described as a nation of immigrants, one group who cannot be described in this manner are African Americans, as few, or if any of them, actually came to America by choice. Scholars disagree as how long various African cultures survived amongst the slaves after their arrival in America. What is clear, however, is that, over time, cultural and religious memories of Africa faded. Around 1800, slaves made up about 40% of the American South. Many blacks were converted because of the Great Awakening, which took place between roughly the 1730s and the 1760s, though this did not lead to the formation of black churches. Those attempting to evangelize black people faced numerous roadblocks. Some slaveholders were fearful fearful of how Christianity might change the legal status of slaves, and therefore refused to grant permission to have them hear the gospel. While other people argued that religious instruction would take time away from work. Still others worried that baptizing a slave would enable him or her to vote at church, or even to claim citizenship. The results, therefore, were discouraging. Prior to emancipation, few slaves received any form of religious instruction. It was the Quakers and the Anglican evangelicals who led the crusade against slavery in a campaign that lasted for decades. In England, beginning in the 1780s, William Wilberforce and his evangelical allies in Parliament led a long and ultimately successful campaign against the British slave trade, which then controlled the transatlantic market for slaves. They later took aim against the institution of slavery itself. In 1807, Wilberforce's bill to abolish the slave trade was finally passed. This closed the possibility of slaves coming to America. This was followed by another long political campaign to abolish slavery throughout the vast British Empire, which was finally enacted against much protest in 1833. In America, opposition to slavery began with the Quakers in 1688. It was slow to materialize, however. The anti-slavery movement in America began in earnest in 1830. A forceful figure was William Lloyd Garrison, editor of a magazine called The Liberator. Garrison was critical of the church for its reluctance to condemn slavery. Evangelical and mainline churches soon became more involved. Abolitionism also gained momentum as a result of the rise of religious revivalism. Charles Finney, amongst a number of other revivalists, were strong advocates of abolition. The American Anti-Slave Society was staffed by young people, many of whom had been converted under the ministry of Finney. Its best-known leader was the evangelical Theodore Dwight Weld, a student at Lane Seminary in Cincinnati. Lane and others soon migrated to Oberlin College in Ohio when the seminary refused to support abolition. Oberlin then became the leading abolitionist center in America, financially supported by the evangelical and wealthy Tappan brothers of New York. Weld wrote a number of tracts in support of abolition, one of which influenced Harriet Beecher Stowe to write the famous work Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Weld, Finney, and the Tappan brothers all worked closely together. There was a kind of division of labor between them, which linked the causes of revivalism and abolition. Prior to 1945, churches and the public in the North were deeply divided in their opinions over slavery. In 1688, German Moravians protested slavery in America. In 1700, a congregational pastor wrote the first anti-slavery tract, The Selling of Joseph. In 1758, Philadelphia Quakers banned its members from participating in the slave trade. Otherwise, many northern churches were indifferent about abolition, and a number opposed it. While northern churches gradually came around in their support of abolition, they split with their southern branches of the same denomination. In the Methodist Church, for example, there was a long history of opposing slavery, going back to its founder, John Wesley, who condemned slavery and the slave trade in no uncertain terms. Despite this, the Methodist Church remained, in America at least, remained deeply divided on the issue. The problem centered upon this one point: preserving the unity of the church versus the moral evil of slavery. Initially, it came down on the side of preserving unity. Gradually, however, the cause of abolition increased in strength in the North. At the Methodist General Conference in 1844, however, it became clear that the North and South could no longer agree on the issue of slavery. The two branches then split and did not merge again until 1939. The Baptists followed suit in 1845, resulting in the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention. Thus, the two largest denominations in America were split over the issue of slavery, some 15 years before the beginning of the Civil War. Other denominations followed their lead, including the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, and the Episcopalians. These divisions made the Civil War more of a holy war than is often recognized. Surprisingly, the Bible was used both to defend and to attack the institution of slavery. Some people at the time argued that the Bible does not condemn slavery. In fact, it allows it. Abraham had slaves, after all. Slavery was incorporated into Israel's constitution. Neither Jesus nor the disciples condemned slavery, only its abuses. The apostles, it appeared to them, never encouraged masters to release slaves, but urged slaves to be content in their present circumstances. Most Christians, however, were not persuaded by such arguments. They claim that God's deliverance of Israel from slavery in Egypt suggests that God hates and condemns slavery. The slavery of the Jewish patriarchs did not justify slavery any more than their polygamy justifies polygamy. They argued that neither Jesus nor his apostles approved of or condoned slavery. In fact, they argued that the Bible never describes slavery as an act or institution of benevolence. So, how did the slaves themselves view slavery through the lens of Scripture? Many people held in bondage in America identified with Israel's bondage in Egypt and expressed their yearning to be free. Their music must be set in the context of an oppressed people. Various biblical symbols and stories were frequently used by slaves in their preaching and teaching. Frederick Douglass described the old spirituals in this way. They were tones loud and deep, breathing the prayer and complaint of souls, boiling over with bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. They often emphasized biblical principles, such as the justice and the judgment of God, and the day of judgment when the oppressed will be vindicated. Slaves closely identified with the sufferings of Jesus. They emphasized certain passages, especially the story of Exodus. Acts 17:26, where, quote, God has made of one blood all nations to dwell on earth, was a favorite passage, as was 1 Corinthians 12:13, which reads, For by one Spirit we were all baptized in one body, whether Jew or Greeks, slaves or free. Prior to emancipation, there was limited growth among black church membership. Most slaves who attended the church of their owners, sitting in the back or in their gallery. For a variety of reasons, a small number of blacks moved to form their own churches. Sometimes this occurred because of pressures from the white church. In other words, leave, we really don't want you here. At other times, the initiative came from within the black community itself, who really didn't want to be with the white church and found the services there, the liturgy and so forth, to be boring. The first independent black church in America was the Silver Bluff Baptist Church in Silver Bluff, South Carolina. It was formed in 1774 or 75. Other black churches soon followed. In 1787, the Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia was formed, the first separate black Methodist congregation. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was officially established in 1816. The oldest black Baptist churches in the North are the First African Baptist Church of Boston, established in 1805. The Abyssinian Baptist Church of New York, founded in 1808, and the First African Baptist Church of Philadelphia, founded in 1809. During the Civil War, there was a rapid exodus of blacks from white churches. For example, the Methodist Church in the South lost 1/3 of its members during the war, with many joining black churches. The Baptist Church proved more attractive, especially to former slaves. Today, around 60% of black church members are Baptist. Their congregational polity provided blacks with the freedom to worship and to set doctrines as they wished, providing an important opportunity to exercise black leadership skills and abilities. While black churches began profoundly to shape the nature of black culture following emancipation, there are competing theories about how this came about. One theory, which applies mainly to blacks living in the North who joined mainline denominational churches, claims that there were few distinctive features about the black religious experience. Most former slaves, it argues, were illiterate and thus received little by way of instruction in the Christian faith. Thus, life in the black church closely resembled that in the white church. Therefore, we must reject the stereotype of the religious black who focused all of his or her hopes on a future eschatology or on the life to come, when the sweet chariot would finally swing low and carry him or her off to heaven, liberated from the miseries of this present life. A competing theory claims that blacks fashioned Christian traditions to fit their own experience of enslavement. Their worship and theology grew out of and responded to the conditions of slavery. Eschatological themes were frequently emphasized, in sharp contrast to those of an incarnational nature. Thus, black theology was often regarded as an act of rebellion, including the theology that founded churches. Often slaves risked beatings, and even worse, in order to meet together for worship. Their religion was thus relegated to the private and secret place, in contrast to the religion of their masters' churches.